R word is no different than the N word.
But I truly believe that the battle of ideas we've already won. We've already won the battle of ideas.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 21 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org. The situation of Indians in America was highlighted in the fight over the demeaning name of the Washington football team. There was an important Indian demonstration outside of Viking Stadium in Minnesota when the Washington team came to play. And we'll have a bit of the comments by activist Clyde Bellecourt. Then to an interesting remark by Miko Peled. He talked about Holocaust survivors and Israel, not in the way you would expect. We highlighted Peled's speech in New Haven last winter. This fall, he spoke at the Tree of Life Conference in Old Lyme, Connecticut. The balance of the show is part 2 of Ali Abunimah's talk at the UCONN conference about Palestinian liberation. As you saw from the teaser, amid the disasters in the so-called Arab Spring, the situation of Palestinian activism is relatively better. We begin with the comments of longtime Indian activist Clyde Bellecourt on Democracy Now! Bellecourt is a White Earth Ojibwe in Minnesota.
Last night, one of the monumental walk took place from the heart of the Indian community in South Minneapolis, one of the largest concentrated Indian communities in America. Over 1,000, mostly Native people, some of them in their full regalia, to show the beauty of our culture, went along with us, marched on the stadium, carrying banners that said the R word is no different than the N word. The R word is no different than the N word. Little red Sambo has to go. Little black Sambo is gone, and now it's time for little red Sambo to go. It's not really the names. It's not just the names. It's the behavior created. When they get a little bit behind, the Washington team or Cleveland, they start howling, scalp them effing twins, scalp the Vikings, massacre them. And our children grab our arms, our nephews and nieces, our sons and daughters. Come on, Dad, come, Grandpa, let's go home. Let's go home. Let's get out of here. It has a tremendous psychological effect on Indian people.
Among the marchers was Ogallala Lakota Billy Mills. Mills astonished the world in 1964 with his amazing come-from-behind gold medal victory in the 10,000-meter race in the Tokyo Olympics. Dan Snyder defends the name of his football team by saying it's traditional. Yes, it is traditional to call the indigenous people of this continent Redskins, just as it was traditional to call Chinese and Japanese people yellow, and to call other non-white people by some imagined physical feature. That tradition is called racism. Among the bonehead comments that have been made about this dispute comes one from the head of the Dallas Cowboys, who said that Dan Snyder couldn't be insensitive because Snyder is a Jew. In reaction, a number of Jews created a petition called "The R word is the same as the N word and the K word." You can see it on the MoveOn site or on our site, thestruggle.org. Miko Peled is the son of the Israeli peace general Mati Peled. Miko Peled had an interesting take on the common belief that Israel is only what's due to Holocaust survivors.
One of the things that people talk about a lot, and is almost impossible to ignore, is the issue of the Holocaust in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, where we hear two different claims. We hear one claim that Israel must, or the Jewish people must have the state of Israel, that the state of Israel must be strong and militarized because it is the only thing standing between Jewish people today and the Holocaust. On the other side, we hear the claim that or the question rather, how is it that people who have suffered so much now turn around and cause such pain to other people? Well, both of these things are not true. After World War II, there were about 2 million Jewish refugees in internment camps in Europe. Less than 10% of those actually immigrated to Israel. The vast majority stayed in Europe or came to America, even preferred to go back to Germany and reclaim their lives as Germans, rather than go to Israel. It's wrong to suggest that Holocaust survivors are complicit with the crimes of Israel against the Palestinians. And furthermore, it's wrong to say that Israel has anything to do with the Holocaust. Because if Jewish people, the very survivors of the Holocaust, felt that this was the right thing to do, they would have gone there. And the vast majority did not. I think only about 150 or 200,000 at the most actually immigrated to Israel, to Palestine. And many of those that did immigrate left. So I think it's important to clarify this and put this in perspective. There's a use, or I should say a misuse, a cynical misuse of the Holocaust in this context. And it's important to clarify that.
Now the conclusion of the talk by Ali Abunimah at the UCONN conference. Abunimah is founder of the Electronic Intifada and author of the book, One Country, A Bold Proposal to End the Palestinian-Israeli Impasse.
Important to mention that whereas the United States government always says it's on the side of democracy, the actual practical experience, not just in the past 3 years in the Arab world, but also going back many decades in the world, is that the United States has never stood on the side of democracy anywhere. Recently, the US just admitted, the CIA just admitted its role in the 1953 coup in Iran. It took them 60 years, but they finally fessed up to what everyone knew. And this has been the experience everywhere else, which is that and I think President Obama articulated this very well in his last speech before the UN General Assembly a few weeks ago, where he said very clearly that the US interest in the region is to maintain US hegemony, which includes not just continued maintaining stability so that the energy resources can flow, but also continuing to play a game where the United States aligns with the most reactionary and anti-democratic forces in the region, which of course includes Saudi Arabia. I wouldn't believe all the hype that about the US and Saudi Arabia splitting up. There is a deep crisis in that relationship, but that's a crisis to do with the sort of rotting foundations of the Saudi regime. But the US and Saudi Arabia still need each other, and they have been working in tandem with what really can only be called a counter-revolution in the region. It began, of course, I mean, if we go back to the beginning of 2011, Tunisia took the world by surprise. But when the protests spread to Egypt, the United States was determined not to lose another domino. They were afraid of a domino effect. And of course, again, it's ancient history and we have short memories in this country, but who can forget Hillary Clinton proposing, the US engineered that Mubarak appoint a vice president. That vice president was Omar Suleiman, a torturer, the head of Egyptian intelligence, who arguably is even worse than Mubarak. He was the American candidate to take over from Mubarak. Let's not forget that. The US was not siding with democracy. Then there was Libya, and I think the calculation in Libya was this. You know, we have to thank Chelsea Manning for revealing so much vital information. One of the things I worked on a couple of years ago was looking through the cables of the US-Libyan relationship in the final years of Gaddafi, and how close the United States was to Gaddafi, and how the US was desperately wooing him to try to bring him into AFRICOM. This is Obama's military command for Africa. And so they really saw Gaddafi as a potential pillar of American militarism in Africa. Once the protests spread to Libya, and it looked like Gaddafi might go, the priority then was to do it quickly and not to have a prolonged period of instability. And this came at a time when European companies, French and Italian companies in particular, had just made multi-billion-dollar investments in Libyan energy. And so they said, well, if, you know, their calculation was, we lost Ben Ali in Tunisia, we lost Mubarak in Egypt. If Gaddafi is going to go, let's make it on our terms. And I'm convinced that's what the military intervention in Libya was about. Of course, the war lasted longer than they expected, and the chaos in Libya is ongoing now, and that's another story. Finally, what we saw in Egypt in July was a military coup. It was a military coup that stalled the revolution. Unfortunately, many of those who had been, many of the so-called liberals who had been on the side of the revolution have now supported the military coup and have forgotten the atrocities committed by the police and the state security and the army in Egypt, and are now singing the praises of a new dictator in ways that, you know, were really hard to imagine just 2 years ago, with Sisi being cast, the Egyptian military dictator, effectively, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, being lauded as a kind of superhero, literally billboards of him in superhero costumes and this kind of thing. And all of this has been underpinned with a narrative of demonizing the former or the deposed president, Mohammed Morsi, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, I have never had any enthusiasm for the Muslim Brotherhood, to put it mildly. But I also don't buy the wildly exaggerated narrative holding them responsible for every catastrophe in Egypt over 12 months, as if there hadn't been 30 years of pillage of the state by Mubarak and his cronies and by the state security. And when, of course, during those 12 months, Morsi was not even in control of much of the state, that you had the deep state in Egypt working against him. And that's not to excuse him for his own incompetence and arrogance and so on. But if you apply to Morsi the maximum blame that he can legitimately be given, it doesn't rise to the level of the exaggerated stories that have been told to justify the coup that happened. And of course, part of this coup, or part of the outcome, has been the renewal of or let's say the rekindling of the love affair between the Egyptian elites and the Egyptian military and Israel. Now, it hadn't been broken by Morsi, far from it, but it has been rekindled with a warmth that Israel was afraid would be lost. And the primary victim, of course, has been Palestinians in Gaza, as we heard in one of the early sessions. But what's been so insidious And we had a question about this earlier today, about anti-Palestinian racist language that one young man heard in Jordan. Well, I have to say I'm not entirely surprised by that, but it's certainly less common than it would be in Egypt, because you have the regime media and the Mubarak elite media inciting now 24 hours a day against Palestinians and Syrians, a kind of xenophobic incitement, blaming them for all the problems of Egypt in a really disgusting and ugly way. But it's had an impact on many Egyptian people who actually believe the false stories that Hamas is sending Grad missiles from Gaza in order to bomb Cairo. This has been all published in the Egyptian media, well documented, that Hamas has sent thousands of fighters to Egypt in order to fight for the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. But the impact of this is that the siege on Gaza has been renewed with a brutality that is unprecedented. I was in Gaza in May. It was my first visit, and it was hard enough to get in then. That visit would be impossible today. And what friends are telling us from Gaza is that the situation has never been worse, and that the crushing of the tunnels. I actually went in the tunnels when I was in Gaza. I didn't get in through the tunnels, but we visited, and it was incredible. I mean, we stood on a platform that was almost as big as this stage, but circular. You could park 2 cars on it, and then it was electrically operated. The platform went down a shaft of about 30 meters, and then at the bottom there was a tunnel in front of you where they could bring cars through and bring a lot of goods. And what we could see was that we could see it with our own eyes, that Gaza was absolutely dependent on these tunnels. You know, the media reports again say, oh, people are bringing iPads and KFC through the tunnels. Well, I don't know if that's true. Maybe it is. People in Gaza have a right to have iPads like anyone else. But what we actually saw with our own eyes was vast quantities of basic supplies coming in, truckload after truckload of gravel, of bricks, of fuel, and so on and so forth, because Gaza still hasn't been rebuilt. And when Egypt crushed the tunnels, closed the tunnels, the true impact of the Israeli siege has started to show now in the really desperate economic and humanitarian situation. So the regional situation looks rather dire, and it is. I think there's no point sugarcoating it. But at the same time, I think that there's reasons not to lose hope. I don't think that the coup regime in Egypt can last forever. I don't think even the $12 billion that came from Saudi Arabia can prop it up. The economic catastrophe in Egypt cannot be concealed. I think that Egypt is too great a country with too much history, with too many amazing people to be constantly worshipping this dictator or that dictator, and that the Egyptian people have taken a really unfortunate deviation from the difficult path of liberation and sovereignty and true independence, and they'll find their way back to it. I think that there is a dawning recognition, although I'm not sure it's accompanied by the political will yet, that the options in Syria are continued bloodshed, which could continue for many more years. We saw the civil war in Lebanon lasted 15 years, but in Syria it's on a much bigger scale. So continued war or some kind of political process. And maybe we're edging towards that now. I hope for the sake of people in Syria that there can be some kind of acceptable outcome that doesn't involve prolonged war. In Palestine, I would say I'm almost more optimistic than anywhere else. That might sound strange when every day people are still being pushed off their land. But I truly believe that the battle of ideas we've already won. We've already won the battle of ideas. And we have to have the self-confidence to demand what that entails: full rights for Palestinians, and a process of decolonization that is inclusive of Israelis, that has a future for Israeli Jews as citizens in an equal state, not as settlers, not as supremacists in a so-called Jewish state. And I think in this country, I feel the climate is changing. I've been doing this work now for, it's hard for me to believe, more than 20 years, and I have seen a change. While we're sitting here over in California, the National Students for Justice in Palestine conference, the third conference is meeting, and I had the privilege of speaking at the conference last year that was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And this movement is truly amazing, and it's making really important connections that I don't think we have made sufficiently or deeply enough in the past, which is to understand that the system of the racial ideology that underpins what Israel is doing to Palestinians is the same as the racist and xenophobic and nativist ideology that has allowed Obama to deport almost 2 million people in the past 4 years. That has allowed this, and by the way, President Obama, you won't believe me when I tell you this, but you can check the figures yourself, has deported, or it will be by next year on current projections, will have deported more people from this country than every previous American administration in the past 100 years combined. And this is accompanied by the increasing militarization of the border, and when you travel to the border regions, I spent several months in West Texas earlier this year, and I'd been previously to Arizona. You feel as if you're under occupation, and people there feel that. You can't drive a short distance without being stopped by the Border Patrol. And it's not just that, it's also a nativist racial ideology, where in Arizona, just like in Israel, Palestinians are now being prohibited from commemorating the Nakba, commemorating their ethnic cleansing. In Arizona, you have a law prohibiting ethnic studies, prohibiting teaching about the settler colonial history of Arizona and the southwestern United States. So the Students for Justice in Palestine are making those connections. They're making the connections to mass incarceration in this country. And these are connections that are not just about the racial ideology, but they're deep. I'll give you just one example. The company that incarcerates Palestinian children in Israeli detention centers, called G4S, it's a British-Danish multinational, is the same company that runs prisons, including juvenile prisons, all over the United States. So this is a movement that is also identifying who is profiting from these kinds of racialized forms of oppression and beginning to build joint strategies to resist. So that's why I'm extremely hopeful about the future. I think what we need to do, and I'll end with this, is to really continue this discussion, not to let it end with a conference, but to make sure that we can find ways to keep these discussions going on campuses. One of the ways, of course, that students are doing that is through divestment initiatives that have taken off and are really going on all over the country now. But even if you're not ready to do a divestment initiative on your campus, to begin to work your way there by even just holding a debate on it. You don't even have to present a divestment resolution, but have a debate on it. Begin to bring the discussion forward and to tie it. Don't just make it about divestment from companies profiting from Israeli oppression, but does the University of Connecticut actually have a social and ethical investment strategy? Who are the other students, and who are the other issues that you can engage in building an undefeatable movement to force institutions like this to be accountable and to end their complicity in oppression? So let me stop there. I don't know, Adam, if we have time for Q&A. I'm happy to, but it's up to... Okay, and thank you.
On Wednesday, December 4th at 6 p.m., Johanna Rivera will be speaking at the New Haven Library. Rivera has been living for several years in northern Iraq, working on issues of water and women's rights. Here's a snippet of an interview I did with her at the beginning of the year about her visit to a Syrian refugee camp in Iraq.
They're given the residency permit, so they're legal residents or temporary residents of Kurdistan, but the camp is very far. It's not in the middle of the city. They cannot walk or, like to pay a taxi to go and to come every day. Like it's tough, and they have the...
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.
When the world has gone crazy and it's all becoming clear, when they're gunning down our comrades and it seems the end is near, as they're loading up the launchers for the tear gas grenades, we can take off our bandanas and kiss behind the barricades. When it's madness all around and you can see this at a glance, we will sing and